So, all right. Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Art Brunch, where we explore the wisdom of the arts, spirituality, and the great ideas, currently from both Eastern and Western traditions. And this is part three of our exploration, and it will be the last. I'll start a new topic next week. But the particular topic this morning is fraught, I believe, with confusion, misunderstanding, and I would argue even prejudice in the minds of modern folks like ourselves. We are exploring today the concept of atonement. Atonement, both Eastern and Western approaches. Now, at least in the West, among sophisticated thinkers like ourselves, the question I believe probably arises, at least it does often in me, why do we need atonement in the first place? Atonement conjures up thoughts, images of placating some angry, vengeful deity. However, the moment we pause and give a little space to the concept of atonement, we might then think of things like the need for forgiveness, reconciliation, character adjustment. Atonement means something is wrong in us and in our relations with our fellows, and yes, in our relations with the sacred, with the divine, and it needs correction. If we break that word down into its parts, atonement, we get a better idea of it. At-one-ment. In other words, that which has been divided, the relationship between us and God, between us and other individuals, or perhaps between us and other sentient beings, and even the earth. It needs to be brought back together, put back in harmony. We are estranged from others and need to be reconciled. Atonement simply recognizes that all of us have done harm and have received harm during our life, and we need healing from the consequences of that harm. Now, before us are two images that have shaped human consciousness for centuries. On your left, Giotto's Last Judgment, a vision of cosmic reckoning where souls are weighed, sorted, and sentenced for eternity. And on your right, a Tibetan wheel of samsara, or sometimes called the wheel of life, which is the eternal cycle of becoming, where beings circulate through realms of existence, driven not by divine decree, but by the momentum of their own actions, by something called karma. These images pose the same question, but in radically different languages. What do we do when harm has been done and cannot be undone? The wheel does not go backwards, in other words. Every civilization must answer this question. Now, the West has given us courtrooms of conscience, rituals of confession, theologies of sacrifice. The East offers us practices of purification, disciplines of balance, and the patient work of karmic repair. So today we'll explore how these two great streams of human wisdom address guilt, responsibility, and the possibility of moral renewal. Now let me be clear from the start. In this series, East meets West, I'm not asking us to choose between worldviews. This is not an East versus West face-off, simply an East and West exploration. We are discovering what each reveals about the human condition, and perhaps what they reveal together that neither could show alone. Take a moment with Grunewald's Eisenheim crucifixion. It's actually a message about justice, sacrifice, and the economy of guilt. Christ's body is twisted in agony, skin erupting with disease, hands clawed in pain. This is not simply an image of suffering, but about substitution. The sinless one bearing the weight of our transgression. This image encodes a particular moral logic, that sin is the violation of divine law, or for some of us, we could say a violation of natural law. Atonement is the payment required for the resulting damage, and forgiveness is something granted from an authority. So the Western imagination of atonement is fundamentally legal. We speak of guilt and innocence, of debts owed and prices paid. The language itself is revealing. Courtroom, sentence, verdict, acquittal. Even our metaphors of redemption carry the weight of economic exchange, Christ as a ransom, grace as unmerited pardon, but also salvation as acquittal. Consider Titian's penitent Magdalene. She weeps, gazing heavenward, her tears a visible sign of contrition. If we merely focus our attention on her, then we are left with the idea that there is no action she can take, no discipline she can practice, no repair she can make. Her hope lies entirely in divine mercy, in forgiveness granted from outside herself. Here's the question this model inevitably raises, though. What happens when forgiveness is given, but the inner life remains unchanged? When the verdict is pronounced, but the person who harmed remains exactly who they were? Well, these questions give rise to the need for actions following repentance. Well, now look at this image again and notice what else is present besides the Magdalene. This work is not simply about receiving forgiveness, but it symbolizes real repentance through specific iconography. Common symbols are present, including a skull. You see that? Which shows that Mary Magdalene is contemplating her mortality. There is an open book, which means she reflects on sacred wisdom. Her gaze heavenward means she is practicing prayer. And notice the jar at the bottom left. I don't know how well you could make it out. It is a jar of ointment, referring to her anointing the feet of Jesus, representing acts of pure devotion. Works like these highlight her transition, then, her work, so to speak, to purify her soul, once grace is offered. In the church, this is called sanctification, which usually entails ongoing practices of contemplation and devotion. And this theology gives rise to extraordinary institutions: the sacrament of confession, the doctrine of penance, the elaborate calculus of indulgences, austere practices like fasting and almsgiving. Now, at its best, it creates space for profound moral reckoning. However, there's also a tension that arises. You see, it could also lead to feelings of constant guilt since we never quite get to perfection. So this work expresses this tension. Is she overwhelmed with the joy of merely receiving forgiveness? Or is she agonizing over her guilt, yet at the same time recognizing her need for the discipline of purifying her soul? So before we head east, let's take a moment and see ourselves in this work. Let's try to see it as a 16th century European would have seen it, and then reflect on our own personal application. All right, let's move on. Now we turn to this mural from Manali in India. It shows Buddha teaching his first sermon in the deer park at Sanat. Notice what is absent in this image. There aren't any symbols of legal transactions, no sense of judgment. There are no scales of justice. The Buddha, he doesn't appear to be pronouncing verdicts. He looks like he's teaching, and that's exactly what he is doing. He is teaching a path. In Eastern philosophy, morality is ecological, it's not judicial. There is no cosmic judge weighing sins. There's no divine prosecutor demanding payment. Instead, there is karma, the natural law of cause and effect. Every action leaves a trace. Every act of harm done leaves the need for a counteraction. Every choice shapes the trajectory of becoming, our own becoming, and that of others. So here is what the Buddha was teaching his disciples. This diagram shows the eightfold path. This is not a list of commandments. It is a training manual for consciousness itself. It says in order to counter and repair the harm that we have experienced in life, we must discipline ourselves to develop right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. This path does not promise acquittal. It offers the opportunity for transformation. Now here is another image of a wheel of samsara, or wheel of life. Harm, from the Buddhist perspective, is not a violation of divine law, but a disruption of balance. Sin is not an offense against God, but an act that poisons one's own mind and disturbs the relational web. Atonement, therefore, is not about receiving pardon, but about restoring equilibrium in oneself, in one's relationships, in the larger pattern of interdependence. Zooming in closely at the axis of the wheel, which is real super close up on the right there, we see a cockerel, a snake, and a boar. They symbolize desire, represented by a cockerel, hatred or jealousy, represented by the snake, and ignorance, represented by a boar. Desire, hatred, ignorance. These are the three poisons, or the three fundamental sufferings, the three things from which we suffer every hour of every day until we reach nirvana or liberation from the cycle of rebirth. These poisons act as fuel, giving momentum to the wheel. Now notice that each animal is holding onto the tail of the animal in front of it. This symbolizes the fact that these negative emotions lead to each other in an endless loop. It is only by our effort and spiritual progress that we are able to gradually gain control and ultimately destroy these emotions. Now, an image like this is probably not as familiar to us, so take a moment with it. Imagine that it has been created specifically for you personally, to understand your own need for atonement and what that might entail. In this moral universe, no one can grant us forgiveness from outside in this perspective. No sacrifice can substitute for our own responsibility. The only path to repair is through the deliberate transformation of our own mind and specific actions, which may require many cycles of life to work through. Now, on the right is a Tibetan Buddhist scroll painting showing us a practice central to this form of Buddhism, the systematic purification of negative karma. Now, the Buddha of purification sits in meditation, holding an object in his right hand and in his left. On the left is the actual Vajra, which is a small scepter. Let me see here. No, on our left, and there's a bell on the right, or in the left hand of the Bodhisattva there. The Vajra is a complex symbol. It's not familiar to us, I don't believe. So for the sake of simplicity, I'll just say this. It represents strength and clarity of mind, the ability to cut through ignorance and delusion. Now, on the left side, there's an actual picture of a Vajra and a bell. That helps. Now, what does the bell symbolize? Well, the sound of the bell calls to mind the empty nature of all things. All phenomena are empty of truth or inherent existence. And this awareness brings true wisdom. When we become aware of the empty nature of all things, we become free of attachment and aversion. And this ultimately leads to liberation from the painful cycle of birth and death. So this is not an image of judgment, it is an image of technique. And we can see it once it's explained to us. Buddhist purification relies on what are called the four powers: the power of regret, the power of antidote, the power of restraint, and the power of reliance. Let's unpack what each means. First, regret. Not guilt, but clear-eyed acknowledgement of harm done. Confession, in other words. Second, the antidote. Meditation, mantra, positive actions to counterbalance the negative. Third, restraint. The commitment not to repeat the harmful action. And fourth, reliance. Taking refuge in the teaching, the practice, the community. Notice what is happening here. The emphasis is not on receiving forgiveness, but on removing the causes of harmful action. In the West, the act of confession names our guilt. In Buddhism, various practices remove causes. The first path seeks acquittal. The other seeks liberation. One wants to be declared innocent, and the other wants to become incapable of causing harm in the future. This is responsibility without shame. You did harm, yes, but you're not damned. You are a being in process, capable of change. The question is not whether you will be forgiven, but whether you will do the work of transformation. Now let's look at atonement from another Buddhist perspective other than Tibetan Buddhism. Before you is a kintsugi bowl, which I discussed recently in another presentation. So this image looks familiar to you. A ceramic piece that was shattered and then repaired with lacquer mixed with gold. The cracks are not hidden. They are in fact highlighted, emphasized, and thus made beautiful. Kintsugi originates from 15th century Japan. It's deeply rooted in the aesthetic philosophy of wabi-sabi, which finds beauty in imperfection. finds beauty in transience, finds beauty in the marks of wear. So I'd like you to sit with this image for a moment, reflecting on the ideas I just presented. This image presents one of the most radical statements about repair in human culture. The West often seeks redemption by erasure, sin washed away, the stain removed, purity restored. Kintsugi offers redemption through visibility. The break is not denied, it is honored. The repair is not concealed, it is celebrated. The kintsugi bowl is more valuable after breaking because it now carries the history of its breaking and repair. It is more honest in that way. It is more real. So this points to a distinction I want to make sure we see between East and West. Scar versus stain. In the Western imagination, wrongdoing leaves a stain that must be cleansed. In Zen traditions of Buddhism, it leaves a scar, a mark of what was, what broke, and what was rebuilt. Stains require removal. Scars tell stories. The kintsugi bowl does not pretend it was never broken. It does not seek to return to original wholeness. Instead, it becomes something new, whole in a different way, beautiful because of its history, not despite it. The ritual of Christian confession at first seems to strictly be about forgiveness from God. But what about those we harmed? In Protestant Christianity, you can be reconciled with God while still estranged from your neighbor. The Catholic tradition acknowledges the power of grace, but requires acts of penance as well, at least as I understand it. Those who confess sins specifically against another are called by the priest to make amends. In the Catholic sacrament of reconciliation or confession, the sincere intention to make amends, to avoid future sin, and to repair damage is actually required for valid absolution. So while absolution removes the guilt of sin, the penitent must perform certain acts to repair the disorder that sin caused. So some Western views are not as different from the Eastern views of atonement as we might have thought, but certainly there's a different emphasis. Let's travel simultaneously in two opposite directions to India and rural America. The images of pilgrimage to the Ganges and Christian baptism reveal another dimension of atonement, that the body is an instrument of moral renewal, the body. In Hindu thought, as we've seen in Buddhist traditions, specific rituals, penances, or disciplines are undertaken to counteract the effects of wrongdoing. These are not punishments imposed by a judge, they are corrective actions, carefully calibrated to the nature and severity of the harm. What's striking is how physical, how embodied these practices are. Fasting, pilgrimage, ritual bathing, the repetition of mantras, acts of charity. All of these engage the body in the work of purification. The Hindu tradition seems to understand something profound. The body remembers what the mind forgets. The body remembers what the mind forgets. The very ancient ritual of baptism reflects something similar. The immersion in water represents a death from old ways that harm oneself and others, and a rebirth to dedication to God and right living towards others. The water also symbolizes the washing away of the stains of past harm. And this cleansing, this purifying is actually felt by the recipient. The coolness and liquidity of the water offer a visceral experience. Now, sticking with India for a moment, here we have an image from the Bhagavad Gita story showing Lord Krishna teaching the karma yoga to the soldier Arjuna. Karma yoga is the path of selfless action. It offers another form of atonement. By acting without attachment to results, by dedicating one's work to the divine, one gradually purifies the accumulated karmic residue. Now, to put this in a very modern and particularly relevant context, I'll use an example of an artist who obediently enters the studio each morning to create without stressing over the outcome. This is atonement through discipline, not a declaration from a cosmic judge. The focus is not on being absolved, but on being transformed through sustained practice. The body, the breath, the repetition of sacred words, these become the instruments of moral renewal. Michelangelo's Last Judgment depicts the divine judgment of people to realms of eternal suffering, the consequences for wrongdoing. In Michelangelo's painting, we see eternal punishment. The damned cast into hell forever, their fate sealed by divine decree. There is no exit. There's no second chance. No possibility of redemption after judgment, at least as expressed here in this work. However, in the Catholic tradition, there arose the idea of purgatory, which is essentially, sticking with the legal metaphor, a pathway of probation leading to eventual salvation. Purgatory is an in-between realm where the deceased can work off guilt through acts of penance. In this engraving by the great illustrator Gustave Doré from Dante's Divine Comedy, Dante and Virgil are in purgatory and looking down on souls ridding themselves of greed and wasteful living. This is achieved by their lying face down on the hard rock and weeping. But there are in the West many stories and images expressing simply profound grace offered without the need for purgatory. In this work, Christ offers forgiveness to a woman caught in adultery. In the story from the Christian Bible, Jesus tells her, quote, "Neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." Let us begin to wrap this up. In the East, atonement is a process, the long work of purification, balance, and transformation. Regular disciplines are required, like daily meditation, to help us achieve this transformation. The West also presents the need for sanctification for moral self-improvement, but only as a response to the profound gift of grace. Perhaps neither perspective then is complete without the other. The West offers us the possibility of radical grace, unmerited, transformative, immediate. And the East offers the discipline of responsibility, patient, embodied, relational. So when East meets West, we see the full spectrum of moral repair. Well, our final image is another example of a kintsugi bowl with its gold lines tracing the history of breakage and repair. It reflects the idea that transformation is not instantaneous, but carries the traces of what we've done and been, and that wisdom comes through the patient work of repair. Perhaps, though, it also reflects a little of the Western idea of the power of grace, the possibility that we can be made new, that we are more than the sum of our failures, that grace just might mean the remaking of us into something more beautiful, not by erasing the past, but because of our past. Friends, when East meets West, we are invited not to be absolved, but transformed, not to erase the past, but to repair it, not to forget who we were, but to become who we might be.